The subcommittee will come to order. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this hearing to examine the status of Chinese human rights defender Chen Guangcheng and that of his family and others who have been targeted by Chinese officials in connection with this case. This hearing will also focus on Chen's cause. Chen Guangcheng is among the bravest defenders of women's rights in the world. Chen defended thousands of women from the ongoing, most egregious, systematic, state-sponsored exploitation and abuse of women in human history, pervasive forced abortion, and involuntary sterilization as part of China's one-child-per-couple policy, and has suffered, as a result of his defense, cruel torture, degrading treatment, unjust incarceration, and multiple beatings. The sheer magnitude of this exploitation of women has been largely overlooked and trivialized by many, and even enabled. The United Nations Population Fund has for over 30 years supported, defended, and whitewashed the crimes against women and children Chen struggled to expose. That's why President Reagan and more recently President Bush defunded the UN Population Fund. In an indefensible reversal, the Obama administration has provided approximately $165 million to the UNFPA. Mr. Chen, as we know, was blinded by a severe fever as an infant and is a self-taught lawyer. He garnered international attention in 2005 when he organized a class action lawsuit against local officials who were forcing women to undergo abortions and sterilizations to comply with China's one-child-per-couple policy. There were as many as 130,000 involuntary abortions and sterilizations performed in Lingyi County in a single year. In response to his heroic efforts to defend women and men from forced sterilization and women from forced abortion, Mr. Chen was sentenced to 51 months in prison on trumped-up charges and then subjected to extra-legal house arrest, where the beatings continued. In response to his incredible escape on April 22nd and the events that followed, I chaired an emergency hearing about Mr. Chen with the Congressional Executive Commission on China in this same room on May 3rd. During that hearing, which took place just days after Mr. Chen left the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, Mr. Chen spoke to us from his hospital bed in Beijing over Mr. Bob Fu's cell phone. Mr. Chen indicated that he wanted to come to the United States for some time of rest, as he put it, noting that he had not had rest for the past 10 years. He asked for a face-to-face meeting with Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who was in Beijing at the time. Regrettably, that didn't happen. He also expressed fear for the life of his family members and said he was most concerned about their safety, especially that of his mother and his brother. He was extremely concerned about their welfare as well as their whereabouts. In that context, Mr. Chen noted that security officers had installed 7 video cameras and even an electric fence around his house in Shandong province, saying that they, quote, want to see what else Chen Guangcheng would do. As soon as the authorities learned of his escape, they refused to allow his daughter to attend school. For these reasons, he was justifiably worried about the villagers and others who were helping him and what they were being subjected to, including severe, life-threatening retribution. Reports that we have received since are corroborating Mr. Chen's fears. Following his escape from house arrest, Chinese officials started breaking into the homes of his family in the same village and rounding up those who have assisted him for interrogations. When local officials and thugs broke into the home of Mr. Chen's brother, Mr. Chen's nephew, Chen Guangcheng, reportedly tried to defend himself with a kitchen knife. He is now in police detention center. I am extremely concerned, as is Chen Guangcheng, for his welfare, as well as that of other family members. The day after the emergency hearing on May 4th, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs posted on their website the statement that, and I quote, A Chinese citizen, Mr. Chen, may apply like other Chinese citizens according to the laws and normal procedures of the relevant departments, close quote. The U.S. Department of State also issued a press release announcing, and I quote, "The Chinese government stated today that Mr. Chen Guangcheng has the same right to travel abroad as any other citizen of China. Mr. Chen has been offered a fellowship from an American university where he will be accompanied by his wife and 2 children. The Chinese government has indicated that it will accept Mr. Chen's applications for appropriate travel documents. The United States government expects that the Chinese government will expeditiously process his applications for these documents." Now, 11 days later, Mr. Chen is still in the same hospital room with his wife and 2 children under de facto house arrest. Although Mr. Chen is under the impression that his application for a passport was made last Sunday when he was visited by a Chinese official, and under Chinese law, blind persons are supposed to be able to apply orally for travel documents, he has not been notified of any further action on the application. With the exception of the half hour each morning and afternoon that the children are escorted outside by one of the nurses, he and his family are not allowed to leave the hospital, and no one is allowed to see them. Anyone who attempts to see Mr. Chen risks severe retaliation. For example, on May 2nd, human rights lawyer Jiang Tianyong attempted to visit Mr. Chen in the hospital. He was forcibly taken away by police officers. It was later reported that Mr. Jian was beaten so severely that he lost his hearing in at least one ear and has been forced to move from Beijing to Hebei province until after the 18th Party Congress. Mr. Jiang was here in the United States in October of 2009 and testified twice before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, an amazingly heroic man. Mr. Wolf chaired one of those hearings and I chaired the other. One of his recommendations was that President Obama should speak with President Hu Jintao and President Wen about freeing a number of political prisoners, including Chen Guangcheng, who was imprisoned at that time. Now Mr. Jian himself must be included in the list of those on whose behalf the United States advocates for. Chinese nationals are not the only ones being prohibited from trying to meet Mr. Chen. The Foreign Correspondents Club of China reported in early May that officials threatened to revoke the visas of foreign journalists who entered the hospital without permission. I would note here that many journalists have demonstrated amazing courage and laudable perseverance in publicizing Mr. Chen's plight. It is largely due to their promotion of Mr. Chen's case that has reached this stage of a possible travel to the United States. I would earnestly ask them not to forget Mr. Chen and his family and extended family and others like Hu Peirong, who are risking their security and their lives on his behalf. The story, unfortunately, is far from over. Before I turn to our panelists of distinguished witnesses to discuss the current events, I would make comments by my fellow colleagues, who some are en route here today, a part of the record without objection. I'd like to now ask our witnesses if they would come to the witness table, and I will introduce them to the subcommittee. Beginning first with Pastor Bob Fu, who was a leader in the 1989 student democracy movement in Tiananmen Square, and later became a house church pastor and founder along with his wife. In 1996, authorities arrested and imprisoned them for their work. After their release, they escaped the United States in 2002 and founded China Aid Association. China Aid monitors and reports on religious freedom in China and provides a forum for discussing among experts on religion, law, and human rights in China. Pastor Fu is frequently interviewed by media outlets around the world and has testified at U.S. congressional hearings, including the one on Chen Guangcheng, including the China Commission, and it was, again, Bob Fu's whose cell phone and his translation and contact made that very important connection with Chen Guangcheng on May 3rd. We'll then hear from Mr. Weijing Shang, who served 2 jail sentences totaling more than 18 years in China for his pro-democracy work. He was forced into exile in 1989, but continued to advocate for human rights and democracy in China. In 1998, Mr. Wei was founded and became the chairman of the Overseas Chinese Democracy Coalition, and an umbrella organization for many Chinese democracy groups. He is also president of the Wei Jingshang Foundation and the Asian Democracy Alliance. He has written numerous articles and regularly speaks about human rights and democracy in China, including broadcasts via Radio Free Asia. I would note parenthetically that I first met Wei Jingshang when he was released very briefly in 1994, in January of 1994. He was such a highly prized human rights advocate that China thought if they released one dissident, they would procure Olympics 2000. When that didn't happen, he was rearrested and brutally beaten and tortured until his eventual release because he was close to death. This is a truly remarkable man. And when I met him in China, he said something, and then I'll go to our next. He said, when Americans and Westerners coddle and treat in a kowtow-ish way the Chinese government, they beat us more in the Chinese Laogai and prison gulags. When you are tough and transparent and say what you mean and mean what you say, they beat us less. And I'll never forget that lesson. He said that in a hotel in January of 1994 when we had dinner together. So a great man, and that was before his rearrest. We'll then hear from Ms. Reggie Littlejohn, who is founder and president of Women's Rights Without Frontiers, an international coalition that opposes forced abortion, gendercide, and sexual slavery in China. She has legally represented Chinese refugees in numerous political asylum cases and testified before the European and British parliaments, the White House, and Congress. Ms. Littlejohn serves as the expert on China's one-child policy for the China Aid Association and Human Rights Without Frontiers, which she is the president and CEO, and has issued several groundbreaking reports from inside of China about the incalculable suffering caused by the coercive enforcement of the one-child-per-couple policy. We'll then hear from Ms. Chai Ling, the founder of All Girls Allowed, an organization dedicated to restoring life and value and dignity to girls and mothers and to revealing the gross injustice of China's one-child policy. Chai Ling also established the Zhenzibar Foundation and serves as one of its board members. The foundation supports the most inspirational and influential humanitarian efforts of students through grant opportunities. A key student herself during the 1989 Tiananmen Square movement, one of the most wanted by the Chinese government, and amazingly, a very heroic character. Chai Ling was subsequently named Glamour Women of the Year and nominated twice for the Nobel Peace Prize. She's the author of the book, A Heart for Freedom, and has already saved a number of little girls who would have been subjected to sex selection abortions in China, who are now living today because of her intervention and that of her organization. We'll then hear from Ms. Mei Onggin, who was born in 1958. Because of the Cultural Revolution, she was unable to finish school. She and her husband were married in '81, just after the one-child-per-couple policy was implemented. As a factory worker in a textile facility, she was forced by the Family Planning Commission to undergo five forced abortions. She came to the U.S. in 1999 and lives with her husband in New England. Ms. May has one son and also lives in the United States. Her dream is to return to school and to finish her education. I now yield to Mr. Carnahan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for really putting together this very important hearing and for your continued work in championing human rights everywhere. I join you in concern for the outstanding issues in the case of Chen Guangcheng, as well as ongoing human rights issues in China. The case of Mr. Chen not only highlights these abuses, but also the need to evaluate the current status of U.S.-China relations. Although still unfolding, Mr. Chen's affair appears to mark a watershed moment for U.S.-China relations. Despite the many serious remaining concerns, I believe it's important to stress the significance of the U.S. reaching two deals on this sensitive crisis with the Chinese, as well as engaging in the annual strategic and economic dialogue as planned. These talks underscore the vast array of national and economic security issues in which the U.S. and China must continue. We must continue to work toward greater understanding. With regard to North Korea, Iran, the South China Sea, intellectual property rights protections, and currency manipulation, just to name a few. I believe efforts to improve cooperation officially and through enhanced public diplomacy will allow us to better address areas of mutual interest and those of disagreement, including the myriad of security challenges and the serious cases of human rights abuses like the ones that Mr. Chen has endured and those revealed in the course of his brave work. Beyond bilateral engagement to address these issues, the U.S. must also continue to pursue engagement through multilateral fora, including the UN, to effect positive change in China. It is important to note, in fact, that the UN Population Fund in China was among the first organizations to raise Mr. Chen's rights and abusive practices in Linyi and with Chinese government officials. I look forward to hearing more about the status of Mr. Chen and ways the U.S. and international community can ensure the safety of his family and his supporters. With China facing a generational leadership change later this year, coupled with major societal, economic, and humanitarian issues as a result of its one-child policy, I also hope we consider what the deal on Mr. Chen reflects about the internal political situation in China and appropriate U.S. actions. In closing, I once again want to thank the chairman for calling this important hearing and the witnesses for being here today to share their stories. Thank you.
Russ, thank you very much. I'd like to now ask Pastor Bob Fu, if you would proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for the Honorable Congressman for your continued support on behalf of Chen and his family. While we're still waiting for a real progress report about the Chen and his close family members, any plan or about the issuance of passports from the Chinese government, today I want to focus on the plight of his extended family members and his supporters. And especially, I'm deeply concerned about the Chen's nephew, Chen Guangcheng. And I want to really give you an update report after talking with at least two of his lawyers and another legal representative in the past few days. Here's the chronology of what had happened to Mr. Chen Guangcheng. Of course, he has been under criminal detention since April 30th, and then on May the 9th, he was formally arrested with the trumped-up charge called intentional homicide. This is what the so-called homicide happened. After Chen Guangcheng's escape last month, the local official who has been directing the persecution of Chen, the town mayor Zhang Jian, led a group of people in a raid on the home of Chen's brother Chen Guangfu that began at about 11:30 p.m. on April 26th and continued to dawn. Without showing any IDs, they broke down the door and jumped over the walls of Chen Guangfu's home and then seriously beaten Chen Guangfu and then his wife, Ren Zongju. And their son, Chen Guangcheng, thought some bandits had come to rob them. So he was himself after he walked out of his bedroom, he was violently attacked for at least 3 hours. And according to the eyewitnesses and his own report, he was bleeding on his face, on his head. And out of that circumstances, he was purely out of self-defense and witnessing how his parents were violently beaten up. So he injured several of the attackers with a kitchen knife. And then early morning of April 27th, he himself, in a conversation recorded by a reporter, and for 15 minutes, he was talking how he was violently attacked. He said he was waiting he called the Chinese police telephone, like the equivalent of 911. He wants to surrender himself, but after waiting for a few hours, he was afraid of his life, so he walked away to another neighboring county, actually at the nearby province of Jiangsu. The county's name is called Xinyi County. And there he was trying to surrender to the neighboring province. And at least from my conversation with one of his lawyers, attorney Liu Weiguo from Jinan, the capital city of Shandong province, on April 29th, that in a conversation he had with the attorney Liu Weiguo, he said, I'm waiting, and I was waiting to go to that detention center to surrender himself. And then on April 30th, obviously, he was under a criminal detention, and later on, he was charged with intentional homicide. And almost all of the lawyers who were willing to handle Chen Kegui's case have lost their freedom of movement or had their lawyer's license being confiscated or held by the authorities, and some of them had been simply kidnapped. And I talked with Dr. Tong Biao, a professor of law at the Chinese University of Political Science and Law last night, and he said he just tried to go to Beijing, where that is his home, on April 12th, and only found himself was kicked out on the April 13th. That's the latest. And attorney Liu Weiguo is losing his freedom moment, so he's not allowed to travel to either Beijing or Shandong at all. And another attorney from Guangzhou, attorney Chen Guangcheng, only after the same day when he announced he will be the attorney for Chen Kegui, his license was announced being held by the Chinese government, so he's not allowed to represent Mr. Chen Kegui's case. Based on the experience of Mr. Chen Guangcheng's trial or pre-trial in 2005, we cannot have any confidence that Mr. Chen Kegui will receive any fair trial. And let me just talk a little bit, a few other cases about those supporters of Mr. Chen who had experienced a tremendous persecution in the past week or so, just simply for being associated with Mr. Chen or being raised awareness. And one of the couple, his name is Lu Haitao, a netizen from Beijing. And just because he tried to visit Mr. Chen, and he and his wife, who is pregnant with a 2 months pregnancy, and was kept being harassed and invited forced to have tea with the public security officers since May the 10th. And then because of that harassment and the threat, on May the 13th, Mr. Lu Haitao's wife, Yang Lan, had a miscarriage. Their 2-month-old baby is gone. And of course, the other individuals, like Mr. Zhang Tianyun, with whom he testified before you, Mr. Chairman, was beaten and was also removed from Beijing as well. And there's another individual whose name is Song Ze. He's a member of Beijing Gongmeng NGO who has been just raising awareness for Mr. Chen. But he, on May the 6th this month, he had been under a criminal detention. Right now, he's being held at the Fengtai District detention center right now. And another activist, Ms. Liu Guohui, who has been advocate and also a constant visitor or trying to visit Mr. Chen in the past a couple of years. And her passport recently was even declared invalid. So she has no way to even travel to overseas. And other lawyers, most of them who are not able to have any freedom moment. So I'm very, very concerned that the Chinese government, especially the local Linyi authority, will make a trumped-up charge based on this trumped-up charge and make a fake trial and expeditiously hand him a very severe sentence. And possibly, if he's convicted, he could be sentenced to death. Where is the way out for Chen Guangcheng? And despite of the fact that the United States and China have reached an apparent agreement and are committed to Chen Guangcheng's freedom and security, and Chen Guangcheng remains under de facto house arrest in the Chaoyang hospital. And I talk with him pretty much twice a day until last night, and this morning we lost contact. And all the visitors are barred, including the U.S. diplomatic representatives are not allowed to visit him. And some of the Chinese supporters and friends who just tried to visit him were barred or tailed or beaten. So all of this shows that the implementation of the agreement and the realization of the commitments are far more important than the agreement and the commitments themselves. I hope that Congress will do more in monitoring and urging the administration to ensure the civil rights of Chen Guangcheng and his family members are protected by the law. And Chen Guangcheng was allowed to enter the U.S. Embassy, and a member of the Obama administration, including the Assistant Secretary Kurt Campbell and Mike Posner, and the State Department legal advisor Harold Koh and Ambassador Gary Locke, all made great active efforts, and of course sacrificed lots of sleepness and during the negotiation time. And although some aspects of the events that followed certainly were not handled properly by the administration, we are nonetheless pleased to see that high-level American and Chinese officials have promised to help Chen Guangcheng and his family come to the United States so they can rest and have further studies in a U.S. institution. And this shows that our country recognizes that it is responsible, for the outcome of the fate of Chen Guangcheng. We hope that member of Congress can provide all the tools that the administration need to back their commitment and to follow through. And we're certainly looking forward that day when Chen and his wife and 2 children to touch the soil in the United States of America very soon, hopefully.
Mr. Fu, thank you so very much for your testimony and for your insights. I now yield to Wei Jingshang, again, a political prisoner for 18 years, the father of the Democracy Wall movement.
1994年的春天，我和史密斯众议员在北京见面谈了3个多小时之后，史密斯众议员感觉到美国政府对中国政府的一些判断可能会有问题，所以他提醒了克里斯多夫国务卿，到北京的时候要和我见面。
In January 1994, I met with Representative Chris Smith in Beijing for 3 hours. And he was obviously concerned of the situation of the American policies about the Chinese human rights. So he advised then Secretary of State Warren Christopher to meet me with me in Beijing in that spring.
从这儿开始，引起了一场很重要的谈判。这场谈判不仅关系到中国的人权民主事业，而且关系到中美关系。
Since then, there was a very important negotiation going on, and that negotiation has not only affected the human rights situation in China, but also affected the U.S.-China relationship.
到现在也没有很多人注意到这段历史。这段历史其实对于美国政府做参考，怎样和共产党谈判很有作用。所以我觉得有必要回顾这段历史，因为故事比较长，所以我请我的助手直接用英语读。
Till this point, there isn't too many people has full knowledge of this history. And I think it's very important to reflect the full accounts of that negotiation, and because it will make a good reference for what's going on as a precedent now. So therefore, I give you a reflection of the history then, and because it's kind of long, so I will have my assistant read out my statement to you. Thank you. In September 1993, I was released half a year ahead of schedule with conditions restricting my personal freedom. Such a release is called as a controlled release by Chinese law. The supervision would not end until March 29, 1994, at the end of my 15-year sentence. After being released from prison, I had done the following work. 1. Help to collect donations for individuals and organizations subject to political persecution. 2. Purchase bank stock shares as a preparation for facilitating money transfers. 3. Planned to establish independent workers' union for workers. 4. Planned to set up non-governmental organizations for artists to relieve them from exploitation of the government. 5. Assisted in offering 1 billion Chinese yuan's worth of stock in state-owned enterprises and improving with the facts after making huge profit that the government has been manipulating the stock market to exploiting mass investors. I met with Representative Chris Smith in January 1994, and we had talked 3 hours in a restaurant in Beijing. And I give him the advice, and we exchanged the ideas as regarding how to push for human rights and democracy progress in China. On February 27th, 1994, following the meeting with Chris Smith, I met with the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State John Shetak privately in a restaurant. He asked me if I was willing to meet Warren Christopher, the U.S. Secretary of State, to discuss human rights issues in China when Christopher would visit China in the following months. Shetak mentioned about the debates in the U.S. Congress on decoupling human rights from trade issues and the potential risks of this meeting. I thought if my opinions would have some effect in preventing the U.S. from moving backwards on human rights issues in China, I would be willing to take such risks and meet the Secretary of State. Shetak mentioned that my opinions has been passed on to President Clinton by Senator Kerry and already had a positive effect on the setup of Radio Free Asia. He hoped my views would help the Secretary of State Christopher. We discussed and agreed on some details of the meeting with Secretary of State Christopher during his visit. In the morning, about 2 or 3 days later, a police who had been in charge of my surveillance came to my home and said their superior would like to talk to me. Later, they brought me to a resort hotel near the Ming Tombs Reservoir, saying that I should relax here and wait for their superior. I asked who would I meet and what to discuss, but got no answers. On the next day, an official came who claimed to be a senior official representing the highest authority in the Chinese government. By observing the way he casually dismissed a police officer to have a private talk with me, I could tell that his status should be true. Based on the fact that he had to leave for half an hour after our talk, then come back with responses, I would assume there were officials with high rankings nearby who monitored our conversation and made the decisions. At the very beginning of the talk, this official said that it was a negotiation because they needed my help. He said that he knew that I had an appointment to meet the U.S. Secretary of State and also know my opinions. We would not change your opinions, but we are not want to do so. We could not change your opinions, and we are not want to do so. But we wish you would not meet the U.S. Secretary of State. I said that's impossible. Because I had agreed to meet, I could not break the promise. He said that they could offer things in exchange. We knew what you want to do, he said. If only you will not meet the U.S. Secretary of State, we will agree to what you want. I said I did not believe things could be so simple. Why so it is so important for me to meet or not with the U.S. Secretary of State? Why would you agree to let me to do the things that you have been prohibiting us from doing just because of this? He said, you might not know how important the Sino-U.S. trade is to us. Taking away those false figures, 70% of our real profit were from the foreign trade, and 70% of that come from the Sino-U.S. trade because the U.S. market's profit was higher. You might think we, the communist government, would collapse without American profit, which is true. I would want to do the same if I were you. But the Chinese people would suffer, and many Chinese companies would go bankrupt. Since you love the people so much, we have guessed that you would agree to our offers. I said, not really. I believe that the collapse of the communist government and the establishment of a democratic system would be more beneficial to the Chinese people. It would be the lesser of two evils, and the interests of the Chinese would be better compensated in the future. He said that you have described the issue too simple. You were once in our internal circle and should know our politics. Do you really think it would lead to trade sanctions? I said, why not? He said that the interests of both China and the United States have dictated that trade sanctions, if any, would be short-lived. The businesses of countries would not allow them to continue to the degree that I would need, that is resulting in the collapse of the communist government. I said, in that case, you had no need to negotiate with me. You also know that I'd rather stay in prison than give up the principles. He said, we knew that. We understand you better than your comrades, but we also hoped that you could think about that carefully. Someone would have to hold the responsibility for even short-term sanctions, and the highest authority would be forced to step down because of that. That's why someone wanted to make a fuss on you, and why we had to protect you from getting into trouble. He also said that, you might laugh at me for such a low-level lie, but I have to tell you that it was the truth. You are now standing at the focal point of Sino-U.S. relationship. If you were in trouble, whether real or false, the highest authority would best in ship. Only after he stepped down could someone take this position. Therefore, some people are eager to get you in trouble to achieve their own objectives. When they reach their goals, they would cooperate with the U.S. government to resolve the trade issues. But you would lose your chance to reach your own goals. You should know better than the stakes in this deal. I said, I still do not believe in your promise. I would need assurance. The stepping down of Jiang Zemin might not be a bad thing, and the person replacing him might want to compromise with us as well. He said, we would agree with the several things that you want to do. Would you think about it again? I have something to do, and we'll come back in half an hour. He gave me a piece of paper with the offers listed on it. The first thing was to release political prisoners, including a list of 35 names. The next three were also what I really want to do. That is, establish workers' unions establish artists' own business, and purchase bank shares and help with receiving and transfer of humanitarian donations. After more than an hour, the official, whose last name was Guo, come back and ask how I thought about it. I said, what you agreed to means nothing. The establishment of a workers' union requires approval from a Ministry of Civil Affairs. An artist company requires approval from the Ministry of Culture, and the purchase of bank shares require approval from a People's Bank. Those were not under authority of a judicial branch. Therefore, all of what you have said sounds like lies. He said, I repeat again that I am representing the highest authority to negotiate with you. All these items are within our scope of power. When the time comes, I will help you to complete all the procedures. I still said I couldn't hardly believe what he just said. He said, how about this? We will add one more offer that you would be able to see. In addition to release the political prisoners, providing that you do not betray your promise, we will not arrest any of your people, by which he means all pro-democracy activists. I said, but you just detained a number of pro-democracy activists recently who are not on your list. What about them? He said those got detained recently had not get into the legal procedures yet. If you give me 1 day, I will get all of them released. We could decide tomorrow whether you would accept our offer. Tomorrow you could make phone calls to verify if we had the ability to keep our promise. The next day, I called several friends and verified that all those detained were indeed released without either conditions nor explanations. But I was still inclined not to accept their offers. This official seems very anxious and almost loses his posture and told me that you must know that we are already bearing a great deal of risk. We have already expanded within the Communist Party. If you still disagreed, then we would have to arrest you, which would just be played into the hands of the other side, and all the offers to you would be blown away. Then he added, the Americans are not as reliable as you might think, and could ultimately reach a compromise with a new leader. Then political prisoners would be rounded up as usual, and you would not be able to complete anything that you want to do. You should think about what is at stake. Let me give you a worst case scenario. Even if we recanted in the future, you at least got a benefit of having the political prisoners released. The other side might not even give you this benefit. At that time, I felt the credibility of his words were pretty high, so I accepted their offers and made a detailed plan for me to leave Beijing to seek medical treatment, and I politely declined to meet Secretary of State Christopher. I felt that I definitely would not get those offers through a meeting with the Secretary of State. And if the US would insist on checking out the human rights issues in China, it would not have canceled the annual review of the most favored nation status. The offer, including the provision that immediately after Secretary of State Christopher had left Beijing, I could go back to the city and continue to do what I wished to accomplish, and they would fulfill their remaining offers. On March 29, 1994, while I was in Jinan, they notified me two things. First, I have completed my prison sentence. I would no longer be under their control, and all my civil rights were restored. Second, also Secretary of State Christopher had already left China. The situation had changed somehow, and they hoped I would spend some time relaxed in the South and return to Beijing after 1 or 2 months. I rejected the second request and insisted on going back to Beijing according to original conditions. I thought by doing so, I could verify if they had the ability to fulfill their promise. 2 days later, I entered the highway from Tianjin to Beijing, but the entire highway was closed, with just a car carrying my friend and me and 4 police cars surrounding us. When I arrived at the exit of Tong County, we were blocked by more than 100 police officers, including agents from several different departments of Public Safety Bureau, the officials from the State Security Bureau, and the prosecutor's office. A police officer who I was familiar with and who has been in charge of my surveillance for many days told me that the current situation was too complicated and they did not know what was going on either. He asked me not to make a stiff stance. And then they were going backroom negotiations. Later, a police who I did not recognize come and showed me the subpoena. They took me and the businessman who was going to transfer stock shares of 1 billion Chinese yuan's worth to a counterfeit antique-making company in Tong County. I slept until the afternoon and then heard the policeman I knew arguing with someone. I heard a strong voice say, "We got orders that no one was allowed to meet this man alone." The policeman I knew said, "We got instruction from our superior that we must meet with him alone. You had no authority to listen to our conversation, and your superior has agreed to this." Then they made phone calls. After that, the police officer I knew took me to a private room in an outside restaurant and told me that after the departure of Secretary of State Christopher, the debate within the Communist Party got more heated. The other side did not believe the Americans and also did not believe I did not influence the Americans. They insisted on handling me by the dictatorship theory of the Communist Party and did not think that they should abide by terms of agreement with me. Otherwise, it would be a loss of the spirit and principle of the Communist Party. Their boss are dealing with this conflict, and they asked me to be more patient. I said I did not know their internal affairs, but my patience has a time limit. On the third day, I formally informed the police who were guarding me that according to the law of criminal procedures, a subpoena for interrogation could not last longer than 3 consecutive days unless they got an arrest warrant. I would leave by my own this evening. They say, "You just wait. We will go immediately to the prosecutor's office to get an arrest warrant." At the evening, I asked if they got the arrest warrant. They said they have not yet. The prosecutor's office would not issue an arrest warrant, but they already had a residential surveillance certificate issued by Public Safety Bureau, which did not need approval from the prosecutor's office. I said that residence under surveillance means that I would stay in my own house and there would be no restriction of my personal freedom. I just cannot leave you surveillance. What are you going to do? It's an illegal detention. They laughed at me and said I should not try to use their legal loopholes. Their laws would be interpreted by them, not by my own understanding. Also, there was none. They would create a procedure, create a precedent for me in regarding this residence under surveillance. And because it did not get into the legal procedure, they did not even need to notify my family members. I would not have any rights provided by the law. Thus, they started illegal detention against me that lasted for 18 months, without newspapers and TV, without any contact with the outside world. From what I learned later, at least by the summer of 1995, the promise of releasing political prisoners and no arrest of my people had indeed kept for about 1 year. I think it was because the trade sanction would not be lifted smoothly and the American people still cared about the human rights situation in China. Otherwise, Jiang Zemin would not be able to get a compromise between trade and the theory of dictatorship and the Communist Party. From this procedure, we can learn several features concerning negotiation with the Chinese Communist regime. One, they are only restrained by their interests, but not bounded by their promises. This is because fundamentally they do not recognize common knowledge and reason, but only their great ideals. This is the same as all evil cults. Therefore, by insisting on staying in China, Mr. Chen Guangcheng made a wrong judgment due to a lack of common knowledge. And the US government did not let him learn such a common knowledge and thus brought to him the trouble that will come up. 2, the Chinese government is not a whole, but consistent of various interest groups. The struggle within those factions like rules and national interests often become bargaining chips between their own negotiations. Promises made by one faction often become targets to be attacked by other factions. Non-compliance of agreement is a common happening in China. The US government, by believing in promises made by one particular faction without any assurance, has made a mistake of a political judgment. 3, taking a hostage first and then make a negotiation is a traditional way of negotiation by the Chinese communists. In their ideology, obtaining maximum benefit regardless of means is a legitimate method against those who are deemed as not fit to their ideals. They would use means to advance their interests, which is their official theory. By returning Mr. Chen Guangcheng to the hands of the Chinese police, the US administration has made yet another mistake of political judgment and will pay an extra price for it. Sorry, I used the extra time.
Thank you for that very, very comprehensive look. And I think part of what your testimony helps to do is to ask the question, and the very pertinent question, how high do we value political prisoners, human rights, democracy, and that the Chinese government and the leadership weighs the resolve and the commitment of the U.S. side in this bilateral relationship. And if we are not committed, all in, if you will, on human rights, they take the measure of our resolve or the lack thereof and respond accordingly. And I think you talked about, the leadership, and especially that it's not monolithic, that there are people inside the government who might even want to do the right thing. But if we're now folding or not extending our very serious resolve to all players, Chen, his wife, his 2 children, and the others, we unwittingly perhaps, but we nevertheless give up what we might otherwise obtain. So I'd like to now ask Ms. Reggie Littlejohn if she would present her testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Honorable members of the subcommittee, ladies and gentlemen, I'm grateful for this opportunity to address the subcommittee here during this very sensitive time of negotiations on behalf of Chen Guangcheng, his family, and his supporters. I've been asked to testify concerning 2 of his key supporters. One is He Peirong, also known as Pearl, and the other one is Zhang Qiangyang, one of his key leaders of his legal team. Pearl, as many of you know, has played a key role in organizing the support for Chen Guangcheng for years. And last time I testified, which was on May 3rd, she had been detained for almost a week. And I voiced the concern that she might be tortured, that the Chinese Communist Party might be pressuring her to disclose the other members of her network. But we raised the issue of her case very strongly in that hearing. Congressman Smith raised it very strongly, and the very next day she was released. So I have Skyped with her twice now, the day after she was released, and then also on Saturday. And she has asked me to read a statement to the committee thanking everyone for the way that her case has been raised in visibility, which she believes is what has resulted in the fact that she was not tortured during that detention. And as Congressman Smith just said, echoing what Wei Jingsheng has said, that this kind of accommodation of kowtowing to the Chinese Communist Party and trying to basically exercise quiet diplomacy is very ineffective, but it's rather when you have transparent, powerful advocacy that people are protected. So Pearl said, I would like to thank everyone who fights for our freedom, activists, congressmen and congresswomen, as well as the U.S. government, the State Department, Secretary Clinton, and the United States. I hope I will visit this great country one day, but now I just want to stay with my friends in China. What I want is for all my friends to be safe. Now that is very courageous on her part, because even though Pearl was not tortured during this most recent detention, she has suffered significant violence. Specifically, on January 10th of 2011, she drove to Chen's village where plainclothes guards smashed her car outside of his home. Then on May 30th, 2011, she went to Yunnan County for Chen's case, and plainclothes guards kidnapped, robbed, and beat her, and in fact, they struck her face 30 to 40 times. She was subjected to a painful position for 4 hours while she was being driven in a car, and then she was dumped on the road. Then on June 6th, 2011, she went to Yunnan County again for Chen's case, and the local officials again kidnapped her and robbed her. Plainclothes guards drove her for over 4 hours and kicked her out of the car into a field where they tried to stuff her socks into her mouth. Then they tied her up and touched her breasts. Despite the violence that she has suffered, Pearl wants to remain in China for the protection of her friends, and I just think that her courage and commitment is to be commended and admired. Zhang Changyang has taken up several sensitive legal matters and has long been a member of Chen's legal team, and for this he has suffered violence on a number of occasions. Most recently, according to media reports, Zhang Changyang simply tried to visit Chen Guangcheng and was beaten so severely that it appears that he has lost hearing in one of his ears. Then, after he was severely beaten, and it became clear that Chen's nephew, Chen Guangcheng, was being charged with intentional homicide, which carries the death sentence, Zhang Changyang stood up for Chen Guangcheng and said that the charge of homicide with intent has been trumped up and that it really should be wounding with intent. So this is, again, he had just been beaten and he's immediately standing up publicly for Chen's nephew. I just can't even fathom the kind of courage that these people have. So he's now reached an agreement with officials that he will not try to visit Chen again, that he will not meet with foreign media, and as you know, he has left Beijing and is now in Hebei. This is not the first time Chen Guangcheng has suffered violence. On November 10th, 2009, or not Chen Guangcheng, but Zhang Changyang. On November 10th, 2009, Zhang Changyang and I both sat on a panel at a hearing before the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, which was called by Congressman Smith. And we both testified on the one-child policy. Zhang Changyang testified concerning the cases that he was assisting Chen on, the ones for which Chen was detained. And Women's Rights Without Frontiers released the Chen Guangcheng report on Chen's birthday on November 10th, 2011, and then at this hearing in English on December 6th, 2011. But Zhang Changyang was telling about these cases where a woman had been forcibly aborted up to the 9th month of pregnancy, where people were sleeping in the fields to avoid family planning police, where forced sterilizations were taking place. It was just suicide. There's all sorts of horrible things that he was reporting on. His testimony and my testimony were similar in the sense of the gravity of the cases that we were exposing, but that's where the similarity ended. I was able to go home safely to my family. At the end of that hearing, Congressman Smith kindly invited the various people who were testifying up to his office, and at the end of that meeting, Zhang Changyang said, "Look, I'm really worried. If anything happens to me, will you please watch out for my wife and my child?" And that statement just struck my heart of the courage that these people have, people who live in China, to come to the United States and testify. They are risking not only their own safety, but that of their families, to expose the truth of what is going on there, not simply so that we will know what is happening, but so that we will take effective action to try to help free the people of China from these horrific human rights abuses. Several days later, when Zhang Changyang did return to China, his fears materialized. He was beaten, dragged away by 4 cadres, and right in front of his daughter, who was screaming, and his wife was beaten. And so then I got a call from Congressman Smith and immediately flew back to Washington to speak at a press conference for him to be released. Despite this violence, Jiang Changyang has persisted in his bravery. In February of 2011, Chen Guangcheng and his wife Yuan Weijing released through the China Aid Association a video showing the horrific conditions of their house arrest. And for that, they were severely beaten and left without medical attention. And then soon after that, a group of Chen's lawyers got together to try to talk about how they might help him. And you have to understand also that the Arab Spring and the Jasmine Revolution are a backdrop to this conversation as well. But many of those lawyers were detained, including Jiang Changyang and Teng Biao. Jiang Changyang was detained for 60 days, and he endured beatings, shouts, shackles, blindfold, and no sunlight during those 60 days. And according to a media report, he was banged in the head so severely that it caused significant memory loss. And apparently what they did was they would use water bottles to beat him in the head. And he had so much memory loss, he could not even remember his Skype password or how the furniture was arranged in his bedroom when he got out. I believe that the systematic persecution, detention, and torture of Chinese human rights lawyers appears to be a deliberate decimation of the Chinese human rights bar. And as an attorney myself, I am very, very concerned about China and the rule of law. How can China say that they care about the rule of law, or that there even is a rule of law, when people who are trying to uphold the rule of law are themselves detained and tortured and have their licenses revoked? Although Pearl and Jiang Changyang appear safe for the moment, who knows whether the Chinese Communist Party will retaliate against them if and when Chen is able to come to the United States. Women's Rights Without Frontiers calls upon the United States Congress and the Department of State to raise the issue of the safety of Chen's supporters, who are heroes in their own right. Thank you.
Little John, thank you very much for that testimony. I'd like to now ask Chai Ling if she would present her testimony to the subcommittee.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Thank you for your persistent 13+ years of fight to defend the victims in China and uphold the human rights conditions in China. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share today about the cause that Chen Guangcheng has fought to uphold. By now, you have heard much about Chen Guangcheng's miraculous escape as the media firestorm surrounded him last week. You probably read details about his journey to Beijing. You learned about the twists and turns in the diplomatic saga that followed. Incredibly, U.S. officials fretted about the timing of Chen's arrival at the embassy. After he left, they downplayed his concerns for his family's safety. Several days ago, an American official casually told the New York Times the days of blowing up the relationship with China over a single guy are over. Maybe they referred the days of, Mr. Wei Jingsheng. But anyway, seeking genuine protections for Chen and his family should hardly have blown up the relationship. But more to the point, it grieves me to hear that Chen dismissively referred as a single guy. He's one man, it is true, but he's a symbol, a hero in the eyes of women, children, and the poor in China. Why? Because he defended them when it was costly and when no one else in China would. He had lived out the words of the prophet Isaiah, who said, "Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, and plead the case of the widow." Often missing from last week's news stories were the calls that defined Chen Guangcheng's work and led to his imprisonment. It explains why he's a hero to so many in China today. I want to highlight this cause. It is the one that we share with Chen through our work at All Girls Aloud. The one-child policy formally sanctions violence against women. Chen knew this. Chinese authorities jailed him in 2006 after he filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of the women who had undergone forced abortions and sterilizations because of the policy. I would like to share some of the stories and images that will show you what is happening in China right now, even as I speak. I should warn you that these stories are disturbing. They will give you a personal glimpse at the genocide or systematic elimination of girls taking place in China, where men outnumber women by 40 million. They show the brutality of forced abortions. They show why Chinese women face a climate so oppressive that a woman takes her life every 3 seconds in China. The first story illustrated how severely the one-child policy can affect a single family. This is Deng Lurong, the picture you can see on the PowerPoint on the screen, who lives in Anhui province. She is the second daughter of 2 parents who violated the one-child policy because they desperately wanted a boy after Lurong's birth. So in her family, they had 3 girls. But after Lurong's birth, officials demolished the family home and confiscated their belongings. 2 years later, Lurong's mother again gave birth to a girl and disappeared 3 days later. Her father fled from the family planning officials and left the 3 girls in the care of their grandmother. Undeterred, officials detained the girls' grandmother in 2002 and left them without a guardian. During the night, a man broke into their room and raped the 12-year-old Lurong. Her sisters managed to obtain the release of their grandmother after this, but the elder woman died a month after she returned home. The rapist, meanwhile, was sentenced to a mere 5 days in administrative detention. Within 3 years, Lurong was sold as a child bride to a man twice of her age. Her sisters were also sold by traffickers and have not been found as of today. When a German reporter and Chinese volunteers found Lurong's father last November, he told them that Lurong's husband had turned her into a prostitute to earn income for him. He beats her frequently and sold her body to bachelors in that area. Deng was in poor mental state. She would roam the mountains for over a week, sometimes before returning to the house. Remember, all of this was set into motion by the enforcement of the one-child policy upon this family and the lack of value assigned to girls and women in China. A second story is Ma Jihong. Last October, officials dragged Ma into a van, that's Ma Jihong's picture before, when she was heavily pregnant with her 3rd child. She died during a forced abortion procedure. That's the picture. It's kind of gruesome. And her family did not know hours afterwards. Her husband and 2 surviving daughters have no real resource to take. The 3rd picture is, I believe that's the 3rd picture. Yeah, that's her family. And they make under $2 a day as a cotton farmer. A final story came out less than 2 months ago on Weibo, a Chinese version of Twitter. It's just an image, but chilling one. A 9-month-old baby is dropped into a bucket of water following a full-term forced abortion. According to the source, the infant's parents did not have a permit for their 2nd child. You can see in that image in the water bucket, that's the baby's body. So I wish I could tell you these stories were rare, but they are not. They're a mere glimpse into the dark environment that one-child policy created for women. This is the darkness into which Chen Guangcheng tried to shine a light. I want to challenge you, honorable members of Congress, to view your callings as servants of people in light of these words from Isaiah. If you do away with the yoke of oppression, with the pointing fingers and malicious talk, and if you spend yourselves on behalf of the hungry and satisfies the needs of the oppressed, then your light will rise in the darkness and your night will become like the noonday. This challenge also applies to President Obama and Secretary Clinton. It is my fervent prayer that your light will rise in the present darkness that consumes many. at this very moment in China. Please continue to press for Chen Guangcheng's freedom and the assurance of safety for his family and his supporters. Their freedom is not secure yet, and you are in a position to act. I urge you to compel China to honor its word and its own laws. If you're concerned that such a cause is not realistic or pragmatic enough, I know you're present here because you're not thinking that way, but we know there are people, leaders thinking that way who are not present here. I humbly ask you to do what is right. It was not economic pragmatic for William Wilberforce to seek an end to the British slave trade. It was not expedient for Martin Luther King to speak out against injustice and then landed in Birmingham jail. Ronald Reagan was not acting with calculated diplomacy when he said, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." I can think of many instances in history where men and women sacrificed pragmatism for the sake of higher principle. Somehow, they always end up on the right side of history. I hope America would stand on the right side of history in confronting this largest injustice in our time. God will honor your courage. Finally, though we are sitting here in the hall of power, we can take heart in the fact that our power is weakness when compared to the strength of our God. We can face injustice without fear because we serve a God who is just, hears our prayers, and can overcome any power. Jesus said, "You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it." We have long prayed for these injustices in China to cease. We know that God is faithful. The only reason why these injustices still happen is that He chose to raise a man and woman among us to end them. And He is patient with us. God can and will end this injustice of forced abortion and one-child policy. We know that. And may it be our generation's privilege to carry out His task. Here's a final story that gives hope. It shows that God does answer prayers. Last year, Nieli Na was arrested. I don't have Nieli Na's picture on the PowerPoint. For being 4 months pregnant without permit. Our team met and prayed for her release, knowing that a forced abortion was imminent. But family planning officials, decided not to go through the procedure at the last minute, and she was released. Nieli Na gave birth to a baby girl 5 months later, so that's her baby girl. But on the night of December 5th, 2011, we learned Nieli Na was arrested again, this time for petitioning the government about her property, which officials had confiscated. She, her 70-year-old mother, and her 3-month-old baby was in an illegal black jail. The guards were hardly feeding her, and her baby was crying from hunger because she could not produce enough milk. The guards told her that she would be there for another 6 months at the least. Christmas, y'all probably remember that there was a hearing the next day on December 6th on behalf of Liu Xiaobo. You allowed us all pray for Nieli Na and Chen Guangcheng and Liu Xiaobo. Many of you all joined us in this prayer. Thank you, Brother Bob Fu, Sister Reggie Littlejohn, for all of your prayers. This is what happened 20 hours later, in midnight on the next day in China, because they were watching us at 4 a.m. their time. Nieli Na was blindfolded, together with her mom was blindfolded, and they drove off and dropped off outside of Beijing 2 hours away, and released alongside, together with her baby and her mother. It was a dramatic answer to our prayers. And Chen Guangcheng's, despite the fact that Chen Guangcheng has not obtained the full freedom, but his ability to escape from a massive prison was no less a miracle either. Your words are so important. Media attention is also so important, and prayers are very important. As we speak publicly, as this Reggie Littlejohn also reminds us, the Chinese government watches us, the world watches us, and acts in response to our conviction. So with your permission, I would like to end this testimony with another prayer. Heavenly Father, you, Lord, hear the desires of the afflicted, and you encourage them and you listen to their cry. You hear the cries of people in China calling for your justice and mercy. You hear our cries as we, too, plead for your justice roll down like mighty river. Today, we lift Chen Guangcheng and his family, his supporters up into your care. For we know you will finish what you have started, and you will surely one day bring them to complete freedom. We lift up to you these leaders here, these servants of the people. I praise you for raising them up and bring them here today. I ask you to move their hearts and inspire them to assist the families and friends of our brave friends in China. Lord, please protect us all from being indifferent when we're suffering. You say that if a single spire falls, you notice. How much more do you notice the plight of your daughters, Ma Jihong, Deng Lurong, and the millions of other women and the babies oppressed by the one-child policy? Please inspire the men and women here today to use their authority in a way that serves the least of these in the world you have created. Now to him who is able to do immeasurably more than we can ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us, to him be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen. Thank you.
Ms. Chai, thank you very much for your extraordinary testimony and the importance of prayer, because they certainly need it, and we all do, so thank you. I'd like to ask Ms. May if you would proceed.
Yes, Yeleva. Yes.
尊敬的委员会主席，诸位议员，非常感谢给我这个机会来到美国国会，向全世界揭露中国一胎化政策对中国的妇女的摧残和对人类生命的肆意残杀。我是梅顺平，曾经用化名刘平，1958年生于中国天津市。我于1999年底来到美国。
Mr. Chairman and Honorable Member of Congress, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to testify today before Congress to expose America and the world how the one-child policy in China destroys lives and the rights of women. My name is Mei Shunping. I had a pseudonym name called Liu Ping. I was born in 1958 in Tianjin, China, and arrived in the United States in 1999.
我来美国之前。 是中国天津市一家国有服装厂的普通工人。因为服装厂里女工多，育龄妇女也多，所以计划生育抓的就特别紧。我就是我们许许多多的被一胎化政策摧残的妇女中的一个。我与我的前夫，也是我现在的丈夫，于1981年底在中国注册结婚为合法夫妻。1983年9月，我们的儿子出生。 按照当时的政策规定，生产后的育龄妇女必须带节育环或夫妻一方做绝育结扎。我那时因为经常血尿伴右侧肾脏积水，尚未确诊原因，医生不给上环，建议我采取其他避孕措施。没有带环就成了我们单位计生办重点的监视对象。
Before coming to America, I worked in a state-owned textile factory in Tianjin. The majority of the workers in the factory were young women, so that family planning policy was implemented strictly. I'm only one of these many women whose lives were destroyed by the policy, the women that Chen Guangcheng tried to help so courageously. I got married in 1981 and gave birth to a son 2 years later. According to the policy at that time, women who gave birth were required to have an IUD implanted, or one of these spouses was required to be sterilized. At that time, I had a swelling in my right kidney for undiagnosed reasons, so doctors refused to implement IUD in me. Without IUD, Without IUD, I became the prime target for civilians by the factory's Family Planning Commission.
1983年，我生了我儿子以后，到1999年底，7年间，我在中共一胎化政策的残酷压迫下，共做了5次人工流产。第一次是1984年9月28日，第二次是1985年12月17日，第三次是1986年3月20日，第四次是1989年5月5日，第五次是1990年12月14日。一胎化政策使我遭受了没有人性的摧残。
With that IUD, I became pregnant. Oh no, from 1983 to 1990, because of the one-child policy, I have to have 5 abortions on the following forced abortions on the following dates: September 28th, 1984, December 17th, 1985, March 20th, 1986, May 5th, 1989, and December 14th, 1990. All the operations were recorded in my medical history. I suffered greatly because of the inhumane one-child policy. 现在可以转给我吗？
因为我的故事太长，我想为了节约大家的时间，我让 interpreter 帮我用英文读我的后边的故事。
Yeah.
好，谢谢。
Due to the time constraints, I will hand over to Ling, who helped translate for me to read the rest of my testimony in English. There were many severe methods of surveillance and punishment to prevent unplanned pregnancies and above quota birth. My factory's family planning commission used 3 levels of control: at the factory level, in the factory clinic, and on the factory floor. If one worker violated the rules, all women would be punished. Workers monitored one another. Women of reproductive age accounted for 60% of my factory floor. Colleagues were suspicious and hostile to each other because of the one-child policy. 2 of my pregnancies were reported by my colleagues to the Family Planning Commission. When discovered, pregnant women would be dragged and to undergo forced abortions. There was no other choice. We had no dignity as potential childbearers. By order of the factory's Family Planning Commission, every month during the menstrual period, women had to undress in front of the birth planning doctors for examination. If anyone skipped the examination, she would be forced to take a pregnancy test at the hospital. We were allowed to collect a salary only after it was confirmed that we were not pregnant. The day of my 5th and last abortion, December 14th, 1990, was the saddest of my life because I was unable to prove that I wasn't pregnant within a 10 to 15 days period. The birth planning doctor in the factory clinic found out about my pregnancy. That day, officials from the factory family planning commissions drove to City Police Hospital and forced me to have an abortion in the birth planning department. It was my first operation in that hospital. All my previous abortions happened in the Central City Hospital. After the abortion, the doctors, without my knowledge, implemented a metal IUD in my uterus. When I learned of the procedure, I protested that I had a kidney disease and could not keep the IUD, but they completely ignored me. The doctors just gave the bill to my husband and told him to pay. While my husband argued with the doctors, I was recovering in the hospital bed. When I left the operating room, still weak, I could not find my husband. I was told that he had been arrested. I collapsed, crying from the physical toll of the 2 operations and the emotional shock. A kind nurse tried to comfort me, but she was pushed away by a man who also threatened to have me arrested by the police. I felt alone, sick, and weak. Afterwards, I learned that my husband had been sentenced to criminal detention without a trial for violating and obstructing the one-child policy, disturbing the normal operations of a hospital, and disturbing social peace. My husband was released 50 days later. I was in great pain from the metallic IUD and the weakness of the abortion and almost did not want to live. The rest of my husband deprived me of care of my family. My young son did not know what was happening and kept crying father. I did not know what to do and could only hold my son and cry with him. Even now, when I think of all this, my heart shuddered and the pain throbs. Those painful 15 days of separation became the catalyst of my eventual failed marriage. My body suffered great damage from all the forced abortion. I greatly grew afraid of a family life with my husband. I tried to find excuses to refuse any intimate demands from my husband. I grew to hate him after the IUD was inserted because I blamed my sufferings on his unwillingness to be surgically sterilized. After the 5th abortion and the IUD insertion, my factory also gave me a serious administrative warning and fined me 6 months' wages. Afterwards, I had to go to the factory clinic every month for exams to make certain that I had not privately taken out the IUD or became pregnant. I carried this IUD in my body for over a decade before I came to America. My husband's detention accelerated the demise of our marriage. He was suspended from his job and censored, and then lost his job in 1991. Our families immediately sunk into financial difficulty. We argued frequently. I was laid off at the end of 1995. I was still considered of reproductive age. The Family Planning Commission of my neighborhood commission took up the job of monitoring me. In early 1997, I spent 40 days taking care of my terminally ill mother. I missed the monthly pregnancy check. Agents from the Family Planning Commission waited at my home to drag me to the exam. When they pushed me to the ground, I felt and hurt my neck vertebrae. My spirit completely collapsed after this. I attempted suicide, but was stopped by my family from jumping out of the building. With the help of old friends in 1999, I escaped to the country that I escaped China that humiliated and destroyed me, and came to the free soil of America. My husband came to the U.S. a year later. We were unable to mend our past grievance and divorced in 2001. I became extremely depressed after the divorce. But at the suggestion of my friends, I started attending church, where I felt the warmth of Christ's family. And then Lord Jesus led me to give up the bitterness in my heart bit by bit. I reunited with my husband in 2009, and we joined together again after I was baptized last year. Now, I think 2 years ago, now we live in the great family of Christ in the free land of America. I feel happiness, but know that back in China, there are millions of women who are suffering like I did. Every day, thousands of young lives were being destroyed. I beg everyone to save them and wish everyone to join me in prayer for them. Let the love of our Heavenly Father, the grace of Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit fill their hearts and release them from the hellish suffering. In the name of our Lord Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.
Thank you so much. Ms. May, thank you for your courage in bringing every woman's story in China to the attention of this subcommittee, and by extension, and I am very grateful that C-SPAN is here, that men and women in their homes will hear what every woman goes through in China and has been going through since 1979, when the one-child per couple policy was first instituted. I think it's very important to point out that in China, brothers and sisters are illegal, and women are treated as criminals if they have a child without explicit government permission. And your story, and I know Chai Ling herself has suffered the gross exploitation of being forcibly aborted, and so many women, by the millions, by the tens of millions, have suffered this degrading and this horrific abuse of women. And again, that's what Chen Guangcheng's mission was, and that's what his cause was. And for that, he has been so brutally mistreated. So I do, again, want to thank you for that. I'd like to now turn to my distinguished colleague, Anne-Marie Burkle, who is a registered nurse. She's also a lawyer, a former Assistant Attorney General for the state of New York. She also chairs the Subcommittee on Health for the Veterans Affairs Committee, but I understand, is Chen on? Bob Fu is going to join us in a moment. We do have Chen Guangcheng, and then we'll go to Anne-Marie Burkle. Again, he joined us on May 3rd and provided very useful insights, to say the least, and so we'll yield to him momentarily so he can speak from his hospital bed again in China. Anne-Marie, if you wanted to say a few words before we...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the chairman for his steadfast pursuit of human rights throughout the world. As you mentioned, 30 years, he has just been vigilant for all human rights. And I want to thank all of you for being here today, for your pursuit of justice and human rights in China. Future generations, you talked about some of the past with Martin Luther King and Ronald Reagan. Future generations are going to look at you and for your devotion to creating a free China. So thank you all very much for your courage, for your willingness to be here and testify before us. We so appreciate all that you do, and we just want to work with you to shed a light on this terrible injustice that exists in China.
We will go to questions momentarily, but I just, Ms. May mentioned how her husband was detained. Again, I think for the purposes of understanding the depravity of the one-child per couple policy, I invited, with the help of Harry Wu, a woman who ran a program in Fujian province. She went under the pseudonym of Mrs. Gao. Well, when she came here, she said, "You don't understand America and the West and really the rest of the world, what a priority it is to the government to impose this one-child per couple policy and to use and employ forced abortion and forced sterilization." She self-described before this committee in this room just several years ago at a hearing that I chaired. She said, "By day, I was a monster. By night, I was a wife and mother of one child." And she said that they used detention against family members, the way Mrs. May talked a moment ago, to hold family members, to put them in prison as they looked to find a woman who was trying to escape the family planning cadres. That is the reality that goes on every day in China that is so grossly underappreciated by so many of us in policymaking positions. And again, when you talk about that kind of abuse of women that is unprecedented in world history, where an entire couple of generations now of Chinese women have been made to suffer that cruelty with barely a peep of dissent from the Obama administration, from many of our friends in the European Union and elsewhere. And then when you get groups like the UNFPA, the UN Population Fund, who say repeatedly that the program in China is totally voluntary, when it is totally involuntary, it is a whitewash that has no comparison either. So thank you for sharing that detail that is so extremely important, that it's not just, if that wasn't enough, the mother herself, the woman herself, who was so hunted and degraded by the Chinese dictatorship. They also look at the rest of the family in a way that parallels what's going on with Chen Guangcheng. It's not just him and his family, it is the rest of his family, the extended family. And without objection, I will put in the record a list of 10 members of his family, including 5 friends who we are deeply concerned about, and that's not the extent of it. Some other friends might be in trouble as well, that we know the government has either arrested, detained, beaten, and then including friends like Hu Peirong, which Reggie Littlejohn spoke so passionately about, and Zhang, who has suffered so much, including the loss of his hearing. And that was just a few weeks ago, just a few weeks ago. We do now have Chen Guangcheng on the line, and I would like to, or we do.
Yeah, he wants to talk about his family.
Please. Okay. Bob, Anne-Marie, would you join us? Chen, Mr. Chen, you are on the, welcome back again.
就是欢迎你再回来，因为就说你自己愿意讲一讲你家人的情况，是吧？
好的。现在可以吗？
可以了。
好的。那么我就是想简单的说一下，就是在他们发现我离开山东以后啊， 他们当时是非常的疯狂。那么以这个我们乡镇的分管政法的党副书记为首的这个张建呢，就带着一批大约好几十个人，据我所知，就是当长期非法限制我们一家人身自由的这些过来的游手好闲的社会地痞。
那我给你翻译一下，我给你翻译一下。
半夜12点多钟吧，就敲我各家的门。
好，我给你翻译一下。I just want to talk about what had happened to my other family members after I escaped from my own home. And on April 26th, around midnight, a group of Chinese government, the local government hired thugs, led by the local township leader, Mr. Zhang Jian, and raided my elder brother, Chen Guangcheng's home at midnight.
在半夜3更呢，家里没给他开门，于是他就命令这伙人呢就翻墙，夜入民宅。这个时候大概12点多钟，然后就把门打开，进去以后就对我大哥大出手。
Around midnight, and those group of thugs by the Chinese, the local authorities, just broke into my elder brother's home and start beating them violently.
这个后来呢，就把我大哥给没有任何理由的就给抓走了。后来我的侄子，也就是陈可贵，他在另一个房间里睡觉，听到声音以后，然后就出来。陈可贵出来以后呢，张建就吩咐他们带来的这些人，就说把他控制住。然后这些人呢，就拿着木棍上去打陈可贵，打得非常厉害。据我所知呢，他穿的衣服，特别是裤子都给打破了，然后脸上打出的伤呢，在过了3个小时以后，血仍然没有被止住，还在流血，可见他们是打得非常狠的。那么我的侄子呢，也就是在被他们这好多人拿着木棍打得受不了的情况下，才开始自卫的，因为如果再不自卫，非常有可能就给他们打死。
And my elder brother was taken away by these thugs and without any reasoning, and then they came back and started beating up my nephew Chen Guangcheng, and they used the stakes and violently and beaten up him, and then for 3 hours he's bleeding on his head and his face was not stopped, and so this is so violent that Chen Guangcheng, according to my knowledge, had to defend himself.
在这种情况下，他的这种反抗就用菜刀砍伤了张建。那么，首先说他们现在给他定这个故意杀人罪名，我觉得这是纯粹是欲加之罪，因为没有人说杀人的时候要在自己家里，而且是半夜3更，被杀的人自愿的跑来，我想这都是完全没有道理的。
This charge against my nephew Chen Guangcheng for so-called intentional homicide is totally trumped up charge, and for himself at his own home to be accused of committing this crime of intentional homicide to those intruders, and is totally absurd and irrational, unreasonable.
这个张建呢，去年曾经至少有4、5次带着宜兰县的脱掉警服的公安，有多的时候70、80人，少的时候40、50人，已经至少有4、5次跑到我家里去打我和我的爱人，然后抢东西，这已经不是第1次了，所以说我觉得他是形成习惯了。
So this guy, this township leader, Mr. Zhang Jian, had led from 40 to sometimes 80 officials, guards, and thugs raided my home and in the past year and beat me and my family seriously. And so this is a pattern already. It's not the first time he had against my family.
事情发生以后呢，我侄子立即就进行了报警，因为这件事情，报警以后呢，结果过了好几个小时，警察也没有出警。但是后来，这个来了很多警察，甚至这个武装警察都来了。但是他们来以后是协助着像张建这些人抢走了我大哥家的所有的通信工具、手机、电话等。
And after my nephew was beaten up, and he actually was waiting and willing to surrender himself, and the police come back again and violently beat up my sister-in-law. And
目前的
你说，
目前的状况呢，就是说，最新的消息就是我大哥呢始终在家里不被允许出村，然后那个有国保在那每天盯着他，然后还有就是陈可贵的律师呢，这个司律师去以后呢，明明拿着陈可贵的爱人亲手签的委托书，但是这个宜兰公安呢就以委托书是假的为由。来拒绝他会验，其实公安很清楚，这个他的委托书是真的，但是他一定要他把陈可贵的爱人带过去。那么很显然，他是要把陈可贵的爱人给控制起来，以后没有办法授权给律师。
So my brother, of course, was taken away without any reasoning by the authorities. And then the lawyer, Attorney Si, who has already got the commissioned paper signed by my nephew's wife, went to the Yinan County, and even though he has the signature by Chen Kegui's wife, the detention center and the public security officers in Yinan County refused for him to meet with Chen Kegui, and by calling that document as a fake document, although they know it is true, and also they just want to have my nephew's wife to come and to surrender herself.
山东临沂宜南警方的这种做法呢，严重的违背了中华人民共和国的宪法，还有中华人民共和国的刑法以及其他方面的法律。这个他们都是非常清楚的，因为他们并不是不知道自己的做法是违法，而是仗势欺人。所以我觉得他们这种做法是没有办法让人接受的，也是像陈可贵的这做法是完全符合中国刑法所规定的正当防卫的几个要素的。
And what have been done by the Chinese, by the Yinan public security officers is a total violation against the Chinese own constitution and the Chinese own criminal law. And of course, those charges against my nephew for simply for self-defense is in contradiction of Chinese own law as well.
这个让我想起了06年他们如何的阻止外边的律师跟我见面，然后逼着我让我接受他们给我找的律师，所以我觉得他们现在还是用的那样同样的方法。
The same tactic, the Yinan County that was used against me in 2006, when they tried to prevent, they try every way to prevent my attorneys to defend for my trial, is now being used again against my nephew Chen Kegui.
给我扫的定之中，我厂队呢自然是更没有道理可言，所以呢，我觉得目前的这种状况，他们已经完全的走到了法治的对立面。
And I do think, those charges are trumped-up charges, and those people in Yinan County has already been on the wrong side, on the opposite side of the rule of law in China.
这是我了解到的家里受到的这种目前就是因我离开山东受到的打击报复的一些情况。但是现在呢具体的情况我还不知道，因为我没有跟我的大哥取得联系，他的通讯工具都被抢走。
And this is so far what I have learned about my extended family members in Yinan County. And so right now I am not able to communicate with them anymore because all their communication tools were confiscated already. Yeah.
Mr. Chen,
thank you for your attention.
Mr. Chen, very briefly, I've invited to the the dais, the people who are testifying today on your behalf. First, Bob Fu.
他说，史密斯议员讲，他说，陈先生，那么今天呢，我们就是特别邀请了一些证人就是代表你在这里特别作证，在这个委员会。
The great Wei Jingsheng.
就包括我自己，还有魏京生先生
，Reggie Littlejohn，
还有 Reggie 这个小约翰女士
，Chai Ling，
还有柴玲女士
，and Mrs. May，
还有这个麦女士
，and we're also joined by Congresswoman Bass，
还有这个另外一个国会议员叫Bass 议员
，Congresswoman Burkle from New York，
还有一个从纽约来的叫 Burkle 议员。
Briefly, the focus of the hearing has been about your safety and your wife and children.
所以今天的主要的集中点呢，是关于你和你的家人你的孩子你太太的安全问题。
With a particular emphasis on your cause, fighting as you did so bravely to defend women from forced abortion.
所以今天特别的一个焦点呢，也是说你自己在中国所奋斗的，尤其是为这些。因为强制这个计生所这个受到的苦难的这些妇女们
，and to rally congressional support and hopefully executive branch support and hopefully worldwide support for your extended family as well as your friends like Hu Peirong.
那么特别呢，我们今天听证会的目的是希望能够这个争取国会和美国行政当局以及世界。国际社会的支持，尤其是为你和你的家人现在所面临的困境我们能够提出最大的这个支持。
If I could ask you very briefly,
Thank you.
Has the United States government, our embassy, been able to in any way make contact with your extended family and your friends who are at grave risk and are suffering beatings?
那么史密斯议员特别问了一个问题，就是说，那么美国政府行政当局有没有做出就是说努力来跟你在这个疑难的家人就是取得联系或者帮助？
这个我具体的不太清楚，但是我知道美国使馆是每天都在给我通电话。
And for that question, I'm not very clear on the specifics, but I do know the U.S. Embassy has been communicating with me every day.
If I could, your wife and your children, how well are they doing under this enormous burden?
那么史密斯议员特别要问你，就是你现在面临这么巨大的一个处境之下，你的太太袁伟静和你的2个孩子他们在里边的情况怎么样？
他们还好。我的孩子说，哎呀，说在这里真好，在这里还可以出去玩，所以这让我非常心酸。从孩子的这句话，你可以想象我以前在山东受的是什么样的待遇。
They are doing fine, especially my 2 children. They kept telling my wife and I that this is such a wonderful place. We can play outside. And he said, you can tell from what they told my wife and I how terrible they had been back to our hometown. They were only allowed to have 1 hour outing every day. Yeah.
还有呢，就是我最近呢，我爱人通过做这个抽血检查呢，发现是严重的贫血。那么正常人要3.几到9.几，我爱人只有2.几。那么长期以来，在他们这种严密的封锁下，我们的生活都是面临着非常大的危险。所以我看到我爱人这种严重的缺乏营养、严重的贫血，我也是非常难受，真的非常难受。
Because my wife and, of course, children had been under such a long time of difficulties with malnutrition and with low, blood pressure, and when I saw them under these circumstances, I felt very saddened.
Wei wanted to ask you a question.
好的，
好的。
这么多年了，可能一时半会儿也没法完全把事情说清楚。我先说这些。
你说让他请律师吧。那么大家呢，就是包括魏先生在内的呢，都是特别建议你就是说一定要请自己的律师就是不要这就政府派的律师这是大家刚才的一个建议。One suggestion from our panel the witnesses that is to suggest to Mr. Chen to hire his own lawyers, not to accept the government-appointed lawyers for his family members. 好。
是。对。
OK， yeah， 小约翰女士呢有一个话。
Okay, this is Reggie. I'm wondering whether there is any lawyer that has been accepted to be the lawyer for Chen Guangcheng. I mean, we've heard that there are 13 who offered. At least one has been beaten. At least one has had his license revoked. And I'm wondering specifically about Teng Biao. I understand that he has offered, and I'm wondering how he's doing. We haven't had much news of him.
对，小约翰女士呢特别问，你知道不知道？就是说其他的这些律师有没有可能，就说那个就说有没有陈可贵的这些请到的律师？那么这些律师尤其是特别是滕彪博士呢，他现在情况怎么样？他们有没有可能去为这个可贵去辩护？因为他也听到一些。这些律师有的被限制在家，有的执照被扣。
我觉得是肯定能去。很多律师朋友都是非常有正义感、非常善良的，他们都表示要去支持有消息说呢，可能最近就会有律师去。
I do know that many lawyers are waiting and wanting to go, and I feel they will be able to go and they're planning to go.
Mr. Chen, Anne-Marie Burkle just asked that you know that all of America is listening to your voice right now. There are large numbers of people from the media here, and C-SPAN is broadcasting this throughout America. What would you like to tell the American public?
那么刚才另外一位这个就现在在就是听证会的这个一位女议员呢Burkle 议员特别问，就说因为整个全美国人民都在现在现场都在听你自己的听你现在的讲话，那么你想对美国的民众就是还有许多的媒体在这旁边你有什么话要对他们讲呢？
我非常谢谢所有的这些关注人类社会公平正义的人士美国人士还有媒体界，特别是这些民众，普普通通的民众，在用自己一颗善良的心关注发生在我和我家人身上的这种不公正，我感到非常的感动，也觉得我们的这个生活在这样一群朋友们的之间，我觉得非常的温暖，让我充满信心。
I want to extend my gratitude and thankfulness to all those who cared and loved my family and myself and our situation, especially to American people, and who shows your care about the equality and justice. Those are universal values. And I'm very, very grateful to all of you.
Mr. Chen, the Chai Ling would like to say something. Chai, come in quick.
所以他是那个，就现在这个柴玲女士想跟你说句话。
好的。
陈茂成兄长你好，我们是都是。
你好。
你好，你好，我们都为你很骄傲，你是中国的英雄，你是全世界的英雄，你是美国的英雄。我们现在有大批的人，成千上万的人都在为你禁食祷告，为你和你家人和你孩子们的自由都在禁食祷告。刚才呢，有个叫梅顺平的女士，她自己得过5次的，又要做过5次的强迫堕胎。她今天也特意来这里呢，来亲自用她真实的名字来作证，因为呢，你鼓励了她，你的勇气鼓励了她。我们就是成千上万的中国的妇女都 都为你的勇气、为你的奋斗而感激。我们赞美，在神面前赞美你，你们会得自由的。中国的这个一胎化政策会完全结束。You want me to
So,
translate to English?
yeah, I want to, Mr. Chen.
Let his answer be the.
哦，那你要说什么话吗？
Mr. Chen.
我想呢，我不是什么英雄，只是我的良知呢，不允许让我看到这些邪恶发生在这些妇女和孩子们身上的时候，让我无动于衷，或者让我去沉默。
I think the question from Mr. Chen was, we are very proud of you as a hero of America, Chinese, and many millions of Chinese women are very encouraged by your courageous act. And what Mr. Chen just answered is, he said, I'm not a hero. I'm just do what my conscience asks me to do. I cannot be silent and cannot be quiet when facing these evils and against the women and the children. So this is what I should do.
Yeah, I also told him that.
当时呢，我只是想，我可能做不了太大的事情，但是对于我发生在我身边的邪恶，我所做的就是我不能沉默，我要把这些东西讲出来，那么实事求是的讲出来。所以我想这就是我基本为人的原则。所以遇到任何周围的这种不管大的小的这种邪恶，我想我是有责任这样做的。
And Miss Telling also said many Christians all over the world and had been fasting and praying for you. And Mr. Chen said, what I have done is just out of my conscience and conviction. I cannot be silent when we see and face these kind of evils.
感谢你啊，就是在这个中国计划生育这30年以后，你是唯一的在中国站出来的，为4亿的被屠杀的婴儿来说话，来奋斗，来呼吁，为成千上万的、几百万的妇女的这个屈辱，来为他们的权益来争斗。我们感激你，我们爱你。You know, so
you have been you're the first man stand up for this 30 years. Chinese one-child policy on behalf of this 400 million Chinese babies who were forcibly aborted and killed. And so we praise you and we thank you, appreciate you.
Until the very end, you will be set free.
是我们是会跟你这个一起一直就是说并肩直到你获得完全的自由为止。
你不孤独。
谢谢。
Okay.
Mr. Chen, thank you.
Thank you
so very much. We will continue. This is the third hearing. The first one was last November when we thought you had disappeared. This is the third hearing, and I can assure you, as chairman of both the China Commission and as chairman of the Human Rights Committee of the House of Representatives, we will never cease in our advocacy for you, your family, your extended family, your friends, and the very important human rights cause that you espoused, defending women from the crime of forced abortion and forced sterilization. So thank you so very much.
史密斯议员刚才特别说，就是说这是专门为你和你的家人举行的第3次听证会。去年11月我们举行了1次，那时候听到你已经就是好像有生命的危险了，我们当时没有办法知道你的情况。那么作为这个府会中国工作委员会的主席和这个众议院人权委员会的主席，那么我可以向你保证，我们在这个会为你的家人和你在仍然在你的村里的家人，会持续的与你这个肩并肩这个心连心这个站在一起直到你们都获得这个安全为止。自由为止。
谢谢。
Thank you.
Ms. May does want to say final.
喂，你好，陈先生，我是梅顺平。
就是这个梅女士，她今天作证，她是因为这个刚才柴玲说，因为这个被这个强制堕胎5次
太感人了。
我非常感激你，非常感谢你的勇气，你能为我们广大的受害的妇女去争取权益。 我非常感谢你，我也希望主能保佑你。我每天会为你祈祷，并且我祈祷上帝能让中国出现更多的陈光诚，为我们受害的妇女去奋斗，去消灭那个异胎化。
So I want to let you know I have been praying for you, and your courage has inspired all of our women, and I've been praying for you every day, and one day that this evil one-child policy will be abolished soon. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Chen, thank you.
那这个史密斯议员特别感谢你了，那我们就
不用。我最后想跟大家说一句，就是他们的地方政府的这些做法呢，实际上都是违背中国的法律，也是违背我们这个国家计生委的七不准的一些标准的。他们只是为了自己的利益去这样做，所以我们每个人都应该负起责任来，对身边发生的一些违法的、不公正的一些事情都要发出自己声音，这样社会就会文明。
So I have a final words that I want to emphasize what had happened to my family and to my extended family members are just a total violation of the Chinese own law, including Chinese relevant law about the family planning system. And so what they have done is just total in violation of the Chinese own law. So they should be held accountable by the Chinese own laws. So that's what I want to emphasize. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chen.
谢谢光诚，辛苦了，好，我们继续为你祷告，再见。
The Paul, is Anne Marie coming back? Okay. I think we're close to concluding this hearing, and I want to thank our very distinguished witnesses and ask them if perhaps they might have some final comments they would like to make. I do, and I say this with all due respect to the President of the United States, I am concerned when the United States government, when President Obama was asked about Chen Guangcheng specifically and human rights, he said, no comment on Chen, and that human rights, quote, it comes up. My hope is that we are in the process of a game-changing reappraisal of our deprioritization of human rights in China and perhaps elsewhere in the world, but absolutely in China, where wittingly or unwittingly we have enabled this terrible crime of forced abortion and forced sterilization to occur while we've looked askance and acted as if it wasn't happening. Chen Guangcheng reminds us in a very powerful way, and the suffering that he's endured, that he stands in solidarity with the women of China, as do I, as do Anne Marie Burkle, as do so many members of Congress, as does this panel. So if you would like to make any concluding statements, because I think we've heard it all with Chen's own voice just a moment ago. Bob Fu's out. So if anybody would like to make any final statement before we conclude the hearing.
Yeah, I would like to, Chairman Smith, you are such a hero, inspiration, all of us too. There's no anyone else in this country have fought and stood together with the victims like Mei Shunping and Chen Guangcheng for the past 30 years. Thank you for your persistence. May God bless you and all the work you are doing. And we do believe this year China's one-child policy and genocide will come to an end. So we encourage the American leaders, including President Obama, Secretary Clinton, and other congressional leaders to join us, join the people, and to bring about an end to this horrific, the largest crimes against humanity on earth in this year. Thank you.
I want to thank our distinguished witnesses. We will continue pursuing, obviously, Chen's case until it is resolved successfully, and the focus that he has brought on the hideous one-child per couple policy will increase in terms of focus, scrutiny, and God willing, it will end. Hearing's adjourned.